The recent briefing by Police Minister Bekele on crime statistics left a lot to be desired. The statistics indicate that the crime rate is alarmingly high. It's not news to any of us. What's more alarming and maybe more newsworthy is that the murder rate, particularly among women and children, is on the increase. So we're joined this morning on TMS by the CEO of Save the Children South Africa, Steve Miller, as well as our socio-political analyst, Jamie Mighty, who joins us via Skype. Steve, welcome to the morning show.
Thank you so much for having me.
So tell us about these statistics in relation to what you do with Save the Children South Africa.
Well, as you mentioned, this is extremely disturbing, and we should never become sensitized to it. You know, South Africa, on an average year, has double the homicide rate for children of the global average. This last 3 months of the year, we saw over 350 children murdered. About 39% of those are at the hands of their caregivers, so people that they know. So the situation is terrifying, but what I would argue for is to tip the balance from viewing this through the lens of criminal justice and looking more at prevention and psychosocial services.
It's very interesting. Please say more, because I don't know if that necessarily always happens. For example, we hear about news stories, they peak in the news, and then they kind of go away. And we never know what's really happening in the background of those stories. So tell us more. What do you think needs to be done?
It's a very human response. If we hear about these numbers, if we hear about a case, if we know somebody, our first reaction is generally anger. We think about retribution. We think about the police, what the police could have done. It's so difficult for a child to report a case of abuse for many reasons. There's lots of training that can happen there. We think about the courts that constantly fail our children. And we wring our hands and we get very angry. But this issue has deep social roots. And so we need to approach it differently. We need to understand that this is a country, as we all know, that has a history of violence. Violence that we've never properly healed from. And it's around us. It's in our homes, it's in our schools, our communities. So there's so many different ways that this issue needs to be addressed from a preventative point of view. Yes, look at criminal justice, but let's rather invest to stop this from happening in the first place.
Jamie, I'm going to bring you in here, and I hope you can hear me where you are. So, I mean, these statistics are for the third quarter of 2021-2022, covering that first period, 1st October to 31 December. So the minister, Jamie, indicated that there's a decrease in most crime categories except for murder. In your view, is this a true reflection of the state of our country so far?
Well, I think what's interesting about the murder statistics is that they are the ones that are most difficult to underreport, because there's literally a dead body there. But oftentimes when you hear instances where there's a peculiarity, maybe a decrease when people have maybe been experiencing more crime, it's an indication of underreporting, not necessarily an indication that the specific crime has gone down. And I think that's what we may be seeing here, where certain crimes people no longer believe that there's any point going to the police. Obviously, there are insurance-related crimes which are consistently reported well, but I think what we're seeing now is that there's some
Oh, what a pity. Jamie's
be occurring.
Right. Okay, we're having an issue there. We'll see if we can reconnect. Would you like to add to what Jamie was saying about
well, certainly. I think what I would add is during COVID that became even worse. If I'm looking at children, you know, how children report perceived incidents of abuse, etc., allegations, is generally through people they know. So it's at schools, it's at clinics, maybe at the police station. But during COVID and the lockdowns, that all stopped. So for the past couple of years, our system, already under strain, wasn't working correctly. So the numbers that we have, we've had to use a lot of proxies to figure out levels of bullying, levels of abuse, etc. So I'm sure, as your analyst mentions, that a lot of the crime statistics, apart from murder, it's quite difficult to get a real handle on the situation.
Because that then is what contributes to what was reported, an 8.9% increase during these 3 months of reporting, 562 more people were killed in South Africa between October and December compared to the same period in 2020.
Yeah, so that's most likely accurate, and it's extremely distressing. And again, I think as South Africans, we really do need to take the long view on this. We're in a horrifying intergenerational cycle, because the number one predictor of an episode of violence is a previous episode of violence. If you look at who's doing this, they themselves, when they were children, were more than likely abused. They were more than likely made familiar with violence at a young age. They learned that it's a way to get what you want or to extract something from somebody else, and they use that freely. It's with us, in our homes, as parents. That's where it starts. Positive parenting, bringing children up without corporal punishment, trying to steer them away from violence at an early age. We all have a role in this.
I mean, Jamie, I'll bring you back in here. Maybe you can touch on some of these socioeconomic factors that contribute to this high level of violence.
Well, I think the first one we always have to address is the quality of education, not only in the schooling system, but also at home and in the community. So if we have a system which doesn't inculcate values which contradict toxic masculinity, we're not going to necessarily see abatement of violent crimes. But also, we need to be speaking about what kind of values are being normalized in communities, because boys are generally encouraged people roughing each other up on the street as a form of play. And that is a precursor to violence, because in the instances where it's no longer a plaything, that's when you start to see violence materializing. And then there's often escalation in instances where there's been alcohol consumption, in instances where there's been some socialization because of the peer pressure that exists. So we need to have a broad conversation about the drivers of violence. The other side of the equation are the economic prospects that people enjoy or don't enjoy. So when people have less economic prospects, they are more likely to do things which come with the consequences which they're not necessarily going to care about. Because what do I care whether I get a criminal record if I have no job, if I'm not necessarily going for interviews? I'm going to fight. What do I care, if I don't have money, that I'm going to necessarily get blacklisted for particular behavior or cancelled necessarily? I'm not going to be motivated one way or another to care about those things. And so we need to look at the conversation happening in the initiation processes, the conversation happening in the cultural spaces, but the conversation also happening in the schools. And schools ought to take a strong line against violence, because when boys fight and it gets normalized and it gets celebrated, or you turn a blind eye to it, this normalizes fighting, and that normalizes patterns of masculinity which we're trying to de-escalate in society, because that's where the violence comes from.
So there are a lot of things that Jamie's mentioned there about the school system, definitely bringing a conversation into what happens around bullying or the enforcement of anti-violence policies in schools. And then perhaps when we get back from the break, Jamie and Steve, we can talk a little bit about the SAPS and the pressure put on the police services. You've mentioned a little bit about, what kind of training perhaps needs to be implemented in the police services, and Jamie will bring you back in to talk about that. I'm also going to open up the WhatsApp line, and you can send us a voice note. When it comes to violence and murder in South Africa, what is your view? How has this affected your life? Share with us here on The Morning Show on E! We'll be